When we started this data collection in early last year, no one, of course, knew when this crisis would end. There was expectation it could end fast, but a year later, we are still in it, probably getting deeper in it, and we don't know when it's likely to end, and therefore, those ramifications of that crisis are likely to remain in the medium term. So this now, as maybe a way of introducing how Kenya fits into this context, we selected a number of commodities, primary commodities, for which the country relies on imports to meet its demand: wheat, rice, sugar, cooking oil, and fuel. And although the country does produce sugar, rice, and even some wheat, the total production over the years has not been able to meet the local demand. In essence, the country still has to rely on imports to meet the demand. Taking the case of wheat, for example, Kenya has in the past been importing quite substantial amount of wheat from Russia. In 2020-21, about 30% of the total imports, which is approximately 2 million tons, were actually obtained from Russia. Now, for sugar, the imports are sourced mainly from Southern African countries, Malawi, Zambia, etc., and about 400,000 metric tons of sugar imported into the country annually to meet the deficit. The same case with rice, and about half of that comes from Tanzania, our neighbors, but some of it is imported from Asia, from India and Pakistan. 80% of the cooking oil, the vegetable oil, is also imported, mainly from Southeast Asia, for example, or about 700,000 metric tons. So given that, and of course, for energy, basically we import everything, whether it is the diesel, the petrol, or even the liquefied petroleum gas that is used for cooking. We are really fully dependent on imports. So given this dependence on imports, in a way the country will be vulnerable to any global price fluctuation that would happen. So in terms of how we went around this work, we started by looking at the weekly price data. We were not even looking at the monthly, because as the conflict was evolving and the global markets were adjusting to the new changes, the prices were changing quite fast, or I expected at least to change rather fast, week by week. So we chose, weekly prices for the commodities that I've mentioned, the food commodities and also energy. And this data is recorded 5 times in a month for the dry food commodities in Kenyan shillings per kilo, and for the cooking oil and fuel in Kenyan shillings per liter. Now, the brief was prepared using an initial data set that was collected between January and June of 2022, mainly from the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock Development, and the energy prices were coming from the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority, EPRA, which basically regulates the prices. And then we focused on 4 markets, 2 in urban setting, 1 in Nairobi County and another in Kisumu, and 2 rural ones in Bungoma and Kirinyaga. Bungoma is in western part of the country and Kirinyaga is in central part, just to see what was happening, not just in the major cities, but whether there were spillover impacts, if any, even in the very local markets. So, these analysis, the way we went about it, we were just tracking these weekly price changes between January and June, as I said, and then comparing those with the observed changes in the global prices of the same commodities. Basically, some sort of trend analysis to see, are the prices locally changing? How fast, how slow? How are those changes compared to the global prices, price changes of the same commodities of their derivative? So, and for the global prices, we obtained the data from the World Bank commodity, sorry about that, data, the market outlook data, which has almost 50 commodities. And the idea here was to try and see, is there any core movement? Is there any transmission of the prices, the changes we were observing in the global market to what was happening in the local market? So that is much as that we did at that stage. Of course, for the analysts, for economists, the idea, of course, is to try and see based on the historical data, maybe time series data, is it possible to associate the changes in prices that were being observed and really link them to the Ukraine-Russia crisis? At that point, we didn't do that. We have since begun looking at the data a little bit more to see whether that exact association or causation can be made. And I'll only be giving a sneak peek a little bit based on the difference analysis that we have done. We haven't applied the ARIMA model yet. So we have tried to look at two commodities, one a food commodity and another one an energy commodity, just to see are the changes that we were observing in this period between January 2022 to June different from the historical trend. So what we did is that we took the average monthly prices for about, this would be 5 years, 2017 to 2021, and then try to see the changes, the month-to-month change. We compare those to 2022, but we were also trying to see, is there another year which would consider, quote unquote, a normal year, which doesn't have a crisis to talk about, where you would expect the prices to just change normally, if you like. So, and then the month to month, of course, would give us the first difference. And then we would try and see what is if we do difference in difference by looking at the changes for the average of 2017 to 2022 and a normal year, and then for 2022, is there any major difference? Is there something, a story there? So I'll be showing that later on. But for now, these are what the basic data was telling us. For example, when we looked at the urban markets, say in Nairobi, we noticed that for some commodities, the price changes were quite significant. For example, we saw the price of sugar rising quite significantly in Nairobi and Kisumu between the first week of January and the last week of June by 93% in Nairobi and 80% in Kisumu. Then we noticed that the price of wheat increased by 24% between the first week of February and the last week of June, but then went down a little bit and was comparable to the price at the beginning of January. Of course, there are adjustments as the prices rise, the adjustment that do happen, the change in source of import and all that, so that there are some adjustments that take place. In Kisumu, however, we saw that the price of wheat flour continued in its upward trend, all the way to June, rising by about 36% in the last of June compared to what it was in January, in the first week of January. The price of rice in Nairobi dropped slightly by about 17%, but rose by 50% in Kisumu over the same period. When we looked at the behavior of the prices in rural markets, comparing Kirinyaga in central Kenya and Bungoma in western Kenya, the price of wheat in Bungoma rose by about 43% by the last week of June, while the price of wheat declined by about 12% in Kirinyaga, and this we could associate with a local surplus that was arising from the early harvest that ran from June to December. And then also we notice, like the case of urban markets, the price of sugar rose quite significantly in both the rural markets, doubling in Kirinyaga and rising by about 80% in Bungoma. So, but the price of rice dropped by about 11% in Kirinyaga, and this is not very surprising because among the areas that produce rice in the country, this is one of them, and that of course does influence the local prices. But when we compare to Bungoma, which is not a rice producing area, the price of rice rose by about 44% over the same period. So how about the energy prices? How are they behaving over the period? Now, it's important to note that while the prices of the other commodities are determined by the dynamics of supply and demand, the fuel prices are regulated by the Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority and are reviewed monthly. So they apply a certain formula to set the price by location, basically, accounting for the transport costs from the port of Mombasa, so that places that are farthest from Mombasa will have a higher margin to take care of the transport cost. But basically, we noticed that those prices were also changing over that period of time. And overall, by the end of the last week of June, the price of petrol had increased by 23%, diesel by 27%, and cooking gas by 12%. Then there is the other question about what happened beyond June. I tried to use the price of diesel in Nairobi just to see how did that continue. Did we see a reversal in the observed rise in price at the beginning of the year? No, it continued to rise. And actually by December, by the last week of December, the price of diesel had risen by 47% compared to what it was in the beginning of January. So, then we now try to compare what we were observing in the country compared to what was happening at the global level. As I said, we got these global price changes between January and May from the World Bank Outlook. The price of wheat within that period had increased by 40%, but within the country, we saw that it actually declined. And as I said, that is mainly driven by the local harvest period and maybe a shift in the source of the import source for the wheat. The price of sugar globally had increased marginally with about 3%, but in the country, it had increased quite significantly. The price of rice, modest 10% globally, but in the country, we saw both in Nairobi and in another rural market in Kirinyaga, it had declined a little bit over the same period of time, again driven by the local harvest. The price of cooking oil was higher by about 27% in both markets, compared to the global increase of about 19%. The increase in fuel, the global price is recorded in crude oil prices, not the refined products, but the increase was comparable, about 31% increase in the global price of crude oil, compared to an increase of about 20% and 11% for diesel and petrol, respectively, in Nairobi, and 27 and 23% in the rural market. The same way, the liquefied petroleum gas increased by about 28% globally, and by about 12% in Nairobi. So here we see a mix of the two, where for some commodities, the price increase reflects what is happening at the global level. But for others, the local effects, especially of production, seem to dampen the effect as the increase that is recorded globally. So I think that I have already explained using the table that was there. So let me now turn to this difference in difference. Maybe just to see here, the first column, of course, we're just comparing the 6 months of the year, because that is what the data covered by the time we were preparing this brief. So this is for cooking oil. So, and then we take the average price of the same over the period of 2017 to 2021, the monthly prices. We then take what we considered, and I'll explain what a normal year is. We wanted to avoid a year that had a global shock like COVID. So we avoided using, for example, the year 2020. 2019 was before COVID. And given that there wasn't a global shock of the magnitude of the Ukraine war that time that could have affected prices, we use it as our, if you like, normal year. And then, of course, now we have 2022 here, which is the year of Ukraine war. And then here we are looking at the first difference, that is the month to month, how our price is changing between months of January and February and March, April and May and June. And you can see the changes there. And then for 2019, you can see some figures that are sort of very comparable. But when you come to 2022, you already begin to see quite some high figures, if you like. Change between 1 month to the other of 24, 83, 20, something that is a bit high. So, and then when we try and basically do the second difference, we notice that the 2021 seemed to actually stand out. And even when you actually just take this second difference and compare with the price for the reference year, you notice that actually there seems to be significantly higher. Like there is something about the change in prices of cooking oil in the first part of the year of 2022 that seem to deviate from the historical trend for the past 5 years, even when you, in the average, you include the COVID year, which is 2020, there seems, and even part of 2021, there seems to be something a bit unusual about that price that could be associated with the disruption that we observe. Now, we tried to do the same for petrol, one of the energy commodities. But for this one, using the same logic of taking 2019 as a normal year. In fact, when I was looking at the data, the COVID year 2020, for those who are from Kenya would know that it wasn't a normal year in any by any stretch, because even the price of these energy products like petrol and diesel were falling all the way to as low as 84 or 85 shillings, if I had the data to show here, compared to what it was historically. But when you try to look at the differences and then the difference in difference, it doesn't come out as though the changes we are observing in the price of this energy commodity petrol being very different from the historical trend. It's more or less within the bounds of the historical trend. All right, so then in terms of our conclusion, we can say that in general, we see some core movements of some of the prices of food commodities in the country when we compare them with what was happening at the global level for both the food commodities and the energy commodities. But for some commodities, for example, sugar, we see it rising even higher than what the global price trends. But for some others, like rice and wheat, as I mentioned, we see a different trend where even in some market, we see a decline. And as I have explained, that is being driven by the local dynamics of local surplus within the certain areas around the markets that we were observing. But for some commodities, we can see that like cooking oil, clearly the change and the rise in price is deviating quite significantly from the historical trend. And therefore, there seems to be that actually the crisis was affecting the changes in the prices in the local market. So this rise in prices, and remember, one of the reasons why we were doing this work is because as the crisis was evolving, the policymakers had to respond. And of course, it was coming, it was sort of a wave following the second wave after COVID, and the policymakers certainly had to do something about it. And indeed, they were doing things. They were taking action, policy action to respond to it. And therefore, it is important because in the complete absence of information, policymakers do make decisions one way or the other using wrong information or whatever information is available. And therefore, our idea was that it is important, even within that very short time, to try and see how are the prices changing locally compared to the global markets, and what can we say the governments need to do to protect the vulnerable people within the country or to respond to the changes. And in terms, and I think that we have done, because this analysis was done for quite a number of countries, as many of you have seen in this series. And I think in the long term, we are saying that it's important to have more freer regional trade, because then our countries can be shielded from the effects of shocks at the global level. There's also need to boost agricultural production within the country, continuing to invest in agriculture, because that can help dampen the effects of these shocks, as already shown. For commodities that are produced within the country, even when the global prices are increasing, when there's some local surplus, the prices don't rise as much, even though the country still depends on imports to satisfy the demand. And in terms of energy in the long term, there's need to really invest in energy efficient and saving technologies as a way of adapting to likely future global shocks. These basically are references, and I thank you all for listening. Back to you, Augustine.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the very informative presentation. I personally enjoy the various impact that you presented. I wonder which questions are there on the chat box. I don't see any at the moment. If you want to ask a question to Paul, please just raise your hand. In case I'm not able to see, someone will help me to pick the questions. We can dedicate a few, we can take a few and then allow Paul to address them, and then we come for a second round of questions. Maybe as we are waiting for others to come in, I have a question for you, Paul.
Yes, please.
With what has been happening since the war started, I believe the Kenyan authorities tried to take some measures. What is your impression looking at the type of measures that they have taken? You just mentioned policy decisions that might be or might not be informed by evidence or by data. How careful have those decisions been? How carefully have those decisions been taken? Being aware of basing the decision on the evidence on the ground. I wonder if you have been in contact with them or your team with them directly to work out some of the orientation to help address some of the issues that the crisis has brought to the country.
Yes, so thank you very much. I think it is a good and relevant question. So yes, indeed, the government of the day was taking measures to respond to the crisis. Some of those measures were sort of a continuation of what they were doing after COVID, or when the COVID came. They, for example, were continuing with the social protection program, where they would send some monthly stipend to the very poor, which they were doing using mobile money. They also had a program on fuel subsidy, which after the new government came in was stopped. Because remember, the context around which these things are happening is that we were having a transition. 2022 in Kenya was an election year. In fact, as the crisis was coming, we were about 5 months into an election, because end of February with an election in August. So there were many things that I think the government would do, of the day would do, to address the crisis. But I think it is also difficult to differentiate what is, if you like, evidence-based, policy sound, and what is also meant as a tool for also ensuring that the people are happy in an election year. I wanted to give the example of the fuel subsidy, which was being implemented in a blanket way. It wasn't targeted. Basically, the government would tell the suppliers of fuel that you sell fuel at this price, we are going to reimburse you. And it was running into billions of shillings. And when the new government came in, it wasn't sustainable anymore, so that has been pulled back. And in fact, I think if we were to continue looking at the trend of the fuel prices, you would notice that from later part of last year, when the subsidy was removed, there has been quite a hike in the prices to levels that haven't been observed in the past. So I would say it was a mix. Some things were based on evidence, but some may not have been, and there have been policy reversal along the way, because some of those are too expensive and not sustainable, if you like, especially if they are not targeted.
Very good. Thank you, Paul. I see someone has a hand, but I can't tell who the person is. I'm not able to see. Yes. Hulda, too. Can you please take the floor? Sorry for the spelling. Your mic.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Indeed, this is a good session whereby we take to look at the impacts that the war between Russia and Ukraine has had on our food systems. So my question would be, how can we now make our food systems crisis-proof? Because this should be a learning point for us, so that if such occurs in the future, or even as we are facing other calamities, such as drought, famine, how can we empower our farmers to be productive so that as a nation we can be self-sufficient? And then in the occurrence of such, we can be able to say now sell our surplus to our neighboring countries and the likes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe as we wait for another hand, let me ask you another question, Paul. You know, in a normal situation where you have ordinary people running the economy, you will always experience a situation where if people are given the opportunity, they will organize themselves in cartels and control the business. With the analysis that you guys have done, is there anything for you to suggest how much some of these prices were artificially inflated without the price inflation being a direct reflection of the scarcity of some of these goods on the market? Is there any way for you to suggest how much this was artificially inflated by some business people that are leading some cartels? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Hulda, for the question. I also see Liz has written a question in the Q&A. She's asking, is there a chance to work in unison with others, such as FAO, etc., to address the policy issues around access to nutritious foods, apart from the commodities you have looked at? So I think I will try and respond to that as well.
Very good.
So, yeah. So first, thank you, Hulda. I think that is the ultimate aim of building resilient food systems in the long term, because we live in a world where we can't control what others do. There are many things that are beyond us, and we live in an interconnected world. So I think we need to take measures. We can't retreat back completely to do things ourselves, because by doing that, we would hurt ourselves. As you said, we also want to, when we produce surplus, we can sell to others. In the same way, they would expect if they have surplus of something we need, we can buy from them. So I think the first thing we need to do, as I have said, the potential for regional trade is very big. As we increase our own production, we also need to trade more among ourselves, okay? We need to trade more among ourselves so that we can actually sort of collectively shield ourselves from things that are happening in places that we have no much control. And I think there is clear evidence to show that we don't trade among ourselves enough. There is still so much potential that we could do. If you look at the data I was presenting, half of our rice is coming from Tanzania. Tanzania is our neighbor, is our friendly neighbor. It is in the East Africa community where we have already clear agreement on trading for basic commodities, actually without much hindrances, even in terms of tax. That is an opportunity we can utilize, as much as we also try to increase our own local production, because again, we don't want to do it to our disadvantage if we are not competitive in increasing production. But generally, everything that we need to do in terms of making our agriculture more resilient, more responsive to climate change and other shocks, I think is something that we need to do on a continuous basis. Now, there's the other question that Augustine, you have asked. I would say at this point, based on the data and the evidence that I have gathered, it is hard to, it doesn't give me enough to say about how maybe certain traders can have organized themselves to take advantage of the crisis as such. Because for some commodities, we could see even prices coming down. For others, they were increasing. I'm not able to, there's no evidence at the moment in the work to be able to point to works of cartels as such. So the only point I would make is that the generalized subsidy or tax waiver that was being given for fuel was benefiting rather few companies at the expense of the taxpayer, because the government would even be borrowing to actually be able to give those subsidies. And I think one has then ultimately to make a decision: is it something that is sustainable, or do you let people feel the pain a little bit, but in the long run save the country? Because when you have such high bill to pay and you don't even have enough money you are borrowing, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Or do you even come up with more smart subsidies? I mentioned in the earlier presentation on Rwanda, I had heard about in Ethiopia, where they were doing it targeted, so that, for example, they would say, okay, if you're operating a public transport vehicle, then when you fuel, you pay the full price, but you get receipt and you use this card or something, and then government can reimburse you. Then you try to make it a bit more targeted rather than generalized for everyone. Now, on the question of nutrition, I think it's a good question. I don't know who in our team of academia, because I know that there is some work on nutrition that is John and others in the team have been doing. I can't authoritatively speak about it, but I think, like you mentioned something about nutrition-related work. If you could say something about that and how maybe it links to the question, because Liz is asking, apart from just looking at commodities, can we talk about the nutrition sensitivity of it? Yeah, so if someone can respond to that. But I know within academia, working with other partners, we are also looking at issues of nutrition as well.
Yes, Paul, you're very correct, but it's not directly related to Ukraine, at least not for now. The Nutrient Smart Processing and Trade Project, recent studies, for example, the study released on Senegal is more on micronutrient adequacy in the countries being studied, so not necessarily linked to Ukraine as of now.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Lai. Thank you, Paul, for the answers. I see one hand from Antoinette Salah, can you please take the floor and ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Butiga. I have actually two questions. The first question is regarding the energy. What is the level, sorry, the level of solar energy usage in Kenya? Because I think that could have reduced some of the costs. And the second question, which tool did you use for the price graphs?
Thank you for your question. Let's check if there's any additional hand, then we can invite Paul to, maybe Paul, you can go ahead and answer that part, those two, then we wait for others. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Salah, for the question. I think that the question on the level of solar energy use in the country, I don't have the figure of head, I must confess. What I know is that there have been efforts by government in the past to increase the use of solar energy. First, by zero rating, so that if you import solar energy equipment, be they solar panels or batteries, you're exempted from paying duties, okay, so that people can use more. There's also a requirement in the books, in the law, that if you are building, when you build, you should have a solar panel, at least for warming the water, and also preferably also for home use, if you like. But the level of using solar is increasing, but it's mainly at the domestic level, to some extent also institution, but I can't quite say the level to which we do. The energy use mainly is for the country. Of course, for electricity, there's a large part that is coming from hydro. The country is at least endowed with that as a natural resource. The second big source is the hydro. There is old hydro system built from very early on that generates, but of course it's dependent on the amount of rain. For example, when there's long period of reduced rain, like now, the level of generation goes down, and then we turn to thermal. So we generate now electricity from diesel, and it's very expensive, as you would imagine, with the high prices, and then the additional taxes that comes with generating electricity is very high. But I think it's something that the country needs to invest more and more. Now, the tool for the price graph, this basically I did them in Excel. I'd be curious to know whether there's any suggestion, but I just did that in Excel. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see there is a hand. If I saw it correctly, the person lowered the hand. Okay, very good. So we still have 5 more minutes or so to go. Yes, I see one hand from Peter Owidi. Please, Peter, take the floor.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. This is Peter Owidi from the Kenya National Farmers Federation. My question would be to Dr. Paul. The effects of the crisis have particularly been strong on Kenya, given the trade disruptions on the delivery of wheat and corn products, which Kenya really relies on these nations. In your assessment, I don't know whether this featured in your analysis, but what are some of the interventions that the Kenyan government could employ to avert this crisis in terms of addressing the wheat supply gap in Kenya? Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Peter, and I appreciate Kenna for participating in this webinar series. I think you play an important role in this policy debate. So I think if you recall the debate around that time in our in the public discourse of how we should respond to this disruption, one was about looking for alternative import source for wheat. And I do remember there was some discussion within the government circles, changing the source, looking at alternative sources, I think including US and other places, Canada, as alternative sources for wheat, so that the disruption in the war would not affect us that much. But remember, there was also a lot of effort. If you recall, I even remember the chairman of the Africa Union that time, I think the president of Senegal, even had a meeting with Putin, the president of Russia, just trying to discuss how they can, even in the midst of war, secure the pathways or the lines, the shipping lines, to ensure that the grain flows. Because, you know, this is a shock. It's not that something that people had anticipated. And you know how countries reacted. You remember even India and others decided to hold and say, okay, from now on for the next maybe months, we are not exporting, because we have to preserve what we have. So I think there were several levels of this intervention. I think at the AU level, there was that discussion, because at the continental level, if you look at the total volume of wheat that we have to get from Russia and Ukraine, is quite high. And you can't do adjustment within 2 or 3 months. And in a situation where potential new sources are holding, or they are also adjusting and thinking about their own food security in the country, is not very easy. But that is, I think, one thing that we can think about now going forward. What are the alternative sources of wheat, both within the continent and others outside, so that we secure our sources of wheat. But more importantly, how can we increase our own production locally in the areas that are suited for growing wheat?
Okay.
Thank you
very much, Paul. I think this is really interesting. Yes, I see Antoinette has a follow-up question. Madam Salah, please take the floor. Your mic, in case you are talking.
Yeah, thank you. What could be your message to a farmer, an African farmer, or an agripreneur based on your analysis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul?
My message would be that there is potential now and in the future to benefit from increasing production, because the population, of course, continues to grow. The demand for some of these commodities, especially the non-traditional ones like wheat, rice, and others, the diets are changing, and people eat more of this compared to the traditional staples. So there is potential there. But the farmer cannot do it alone. I think I would say, when I speak to the farmer, his collective voice, for example, through organizations like KENAF in Kenya, is very important, because the farmer on their own, they can do, but there are a lot of things that are beyond their control. Creating opportunity to trade and allowing freer trade is outside the scope of the farmer. So his surplus production may have a market across the border, But if the government of the day somehow restricts them, like we have seen in the past, and then begins to own, the farmer produces, but somehow the government owns his food and says where he can sell or not sell, that is something that is beyond the farmer, but collectively working together among themselves and others to create an environment which is more freer for them to trade, there is potential. And yes, and good returns for the investments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. I think we now have 3 minutes left to go. Can you please, Paul, in 1 minute, give us your last comments or words to conclude this very interesting webinar on the impact of the Ukraine crisis on the commodity market in Kenya? And then we invite Lai to close the meeting.
Okay, thank you very much, Augustine. I thank you even for good moderation. And I thank you all the participants for availing their 1 hour to listen to us. First, I want to encourage, especially those who are in Kenya, that Academia 2063 is working on issues in the continent, and Kenya is one of the places that we are working and doing analysis, and therefore keep watch so that you can hear more and more of what we are doing. We are also happy to participate in any policy discourse and debates in the country. On the subject matter, I think that this was an initial analysis. We will look at possibilities of following this up, especially using the data for the rest of the year to see how these trends have behaved for the rest of the year and the implications for the country going forward. And we will be providing the results and the policy recommendation and making them available for the policy makers in the country to act upon. Otherwise, I thank you all for being here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the participants in this webinar. Let me turn to Dr. Butake to guide us on the next step.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wambo Yamje, for moderating this session beautifully as always. And thank you to our speaker, Dr. Paul Buthiga. I know we will have you back again because you have been a consistent contributing researcher in this Russia-Ukraine war research. So we will have you back for one of our upcoming sessions. Always a pleasure to have you present our findings to our partners and friends. Thank you so much to all our attendees for the engaging conversation we had today. Welcome back same time next week for session 11. And we will have a presentation by Dr. Ismail Fofana, Director of Capacity and Deployment at Academia 2063. And we are going to discuss next week, we're going to have a session based on briefs 21 and briefs 22, and it will be themed the Ukraine crisis and African economies, global fertilizer and wheat trade and market disruptions, impact on agricultural productivity, growth and food security for Rwanda. So Rwanda will be on the stage next week. Please go to the chat and click on the link to our slide share, and you will be able to view all the PowerPoint presentations from this webinar series, which we launched last November. And of course, go to academia2063.org and visit our Ukraine crisis portal, where you will find all the 23 briefs published so far and counting. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and we are excited to welcome you back next week. Have an excellent day and rest of the week. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.